Colleagues, welcome back after the coffee break, and I'm really very much pleased to introduce our second speaker today, who is Andrei Illarionov. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity in Washington, D.C. From 2000 to December 2005, he was the chief economic advisor to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Dr. Illarionov also served as the President's personal representative in the G8. He is one of Russia's most forceful and articulate advocates for an open society and democratic capitalism. Illarionov received his PhD from St. Petersburg University in 1987. From 1993 to 1994, he served as chief economic advisor to the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Viktor Chernomyrdin. He resigned in February to protest changes in the government's economic policy. Illarionov has co-authored several economic programs for Russian governments and has written 3 books and more than 300 articles on Russian economic and social policies. Dr. Illarionov, we are very pleased to have you with us to discuss the political and economic situation in Ukraine and its relationship with Russia and the West. Thank you for joining us here, and we look forward very much to your presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is a high honor, a special pleasure for me to be here, and I have a chance to share with you some comments and ideas concerning the current state of affairs in Ukraine, Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, and some other places. Even the title of the talk is about Ukraine and Russia. I think it would be rather hard for me to avoid touching some other areas that related to the development over the last several months. Over the last several months, many people around the world keep asking what is going on. What does it mean, this Mr. Putin's attack on Ukraine, occupation and annexation of Crimea, Russian regime's interference in eastern Ukraine? What are Putin's real and long-term targets? Where and when is he going to stop, if any? So I have prepared 10 main points that I'd like to share with you. It would be very brief. It's a very telegraphic style, but I would be happy to try to answer your questions. The first point is there is a lot of statement that is a Ukrainian crisis or crisis in Ukraine. It is neither crisis in Ukraine nor Ukrainian crisis. This is not internal affair of Ukraine. This is a war. This is a Russian-Ukrainian war. To be correct, it is Mr. Putin's war against Ukraine. And this war is only introductory chapter of much larger event which can be called war, and actually it's already been called war. It's been called World War, and it's been called Fourth World War. I'll try to elaborate this later, but that's not my choice of this particular term. That's a term that is being used by Kremlin propaganda machine, that this is a Fourth World War against the rest of the world that is being waged right now by the Russian regime. Second point, I'd like also to attract your attention that in some analytical work we can find a description of this war as a Cold War, either restoration of some kind of old Cold War or starting a new Cold War. To my mind, it is neither a continuation of the Cold War that ended at the brink of the 1980s and 1990s with settlement in Europe. And this is not a new Cold War. I would like to attract your attention to the fact that during Cold War, that Cold War after the Second World War, sometimes it's been called Third World War, during the Cold War there was no occupation and annexation of any part of any European country. That happened right now. There were attempts to change regimes, political regimes in some countries, but the borders between free world and non-free world in Europe did not change. Also, another very substantial difference between the current situation and the Cold War, that time there was no personal sanctions. There were some other sanctions, but not personal sanctions. So that's not a Cold War. What would be the right title of this new war remains to be seen. Certainly, it's a work for analysts and politicians. Nevertheless, it's not a Cold War. Once again, I remind you that Kremlin propaganda machine already called it as a fourth world war. Third, for many people, this war happened to be a kind of wake-up call. Some people say that for the first time, some kind of Russian troops to move to another country, or a few months ago, everything was okay, and we had a wonderful relations with Russia and so on and so on, and all of a sudden, everything has changed. Let me remind you that not only a few months ago, but a few years ago, namely 6 years ago, there was a Russian-Georgian war. There was a Russian aggression against independent Georgia that led to intervention into Georgia of Russian troops and occupation of 2 Georgian provinces that now it's about 20% of the Georgian territory. Some technologies of that war, Russian-Georgian war, have been repeated now in Ukraine. Some have been updated and developed. Unfortunately, lessons of the Russian-Georgian war have not been learned, have not been very well studied, have not been learned, and the conclusions have not been made. It was a very wide kind of shared desire to blame for what happened 6 years ago on President of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, for the so-called mistakes, and just desire to forget what happened. But today, or 3 months ago, in Ukraine, there was no Ukrainian Mikhail Saakashvili. There was a Viktor Yanukovych over there, one of the most pro-Russian and pro-Putin's president in the whole post-Soviet space. And the Russian troops started military operation for occupation and annexation of Crimea on February 20th, as the Russian Minister of Defense has announced recently, which was 2 days before Mr. Yanukovych has signed agreement with 3 opposition leaders and with 3 foreign ministers from Europe, and 4 days before Mr. Yanukovych ran from the territory of Ukraine on the board of the Russian Navy ship. So that aggression happened not as a result of Maidan revolution, not as a result of overthrow of Mr. Yanukovych. It was started when Yanukovych was a full-fledged legitimate president of Ukraine. So that is why it doesn't matter whether Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia or Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine or whoever in any other place in any country that is being considered as a part of the spheres of imperial interests, it can be, that country can be target of the aggression. Fourth, moreover, 20 plus years ago, there was not only Russian-Georgian, there were wars in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria. And if someone can be thankful for the Crimean operation and for operations in eastern Ukraine that is performed by Russian Spetsnaz and commanders and so-called volunteers and Chechens and Dagestani and Ossetians and so on, it would be for open, public, worldwide demonstrations of the methods undertaken in all those cases, meaning Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, Russian-Georgian war, Russian-Ukrainian war. So the previous case of these similar operations with little green men was the occupation and annexation not even of these post-Soviet countries, but of 3 Baltic states in 1940. And I would like to attract your attention to the little booklet that has been distributed for the delegates of this assembly, Lessons of History, the Silent Occupation of 1940, that actually showed that some methods, basic methods that have been undertaking right now in Ukraine, 6 years ago in Georgia, 20+ years in Transnistria, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, for the first time have been tried in both the countries in the 1940s. And thank you, our Lithuanian host, for preparing this booklet, which very important to understand this historical connection between those events. And frankly speaking, it's even can be these traces can be these methods can be traced even earlier to the so-called October Revolution in Russia. The methods of military coup with establishing of the terrorist regime, with the killing, torturing, murdering political opponents, with falsifying elections and referendums, and establishing a new either authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, either in Russia or in Cuba or in North Korea or in some other places. My fifth point concerning Ukraine. Certainly it's a huge topic to discuss right now, but I'd like to mention probably the most important process that is underway in Ukraine over the last 20+ years since receiving its independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This process of the gradual but very fast westernization, political westernization of the country. Sometimes it also has a shape of Ukrainization, but essentially it is a spread of Western type of institutions and type of behavior for more and more territories of Ukraine, for more and more people in Ukraine. In the election of 1991, the Western orientation, the Western values, pro-Western politicians got support of only 3 out of 25 Ukrainian oblasts. The frontier between the Western orientation and so-called, I would not say pro-Russian, I would say pro-Soviet orientation, along those 20 years was moving fast from northwest of Ukraine to southeast. For some period of time, there was an impression, incorrect one, that the process stalled with roughly half of the country regularly voting for the so-called Orange Coalition, pro-Western forces, and another half for the so-called Blue and White Coalition, or so-called pro-Soviet forces in Ukraine. In reality, the process continued and intensified very much, especially under Presidents Yushchenko and Yanukovych. By summer year 2013, pro-Western, pro-European forces in Ukraine were winning with a very solid gap over pro-Soviet, pro-so-called Eurasian forces. Having understood that Ukraine is leaving the pro-Soviet, pro-Eastern, pro-Eurasian sphere of imperial influence, Mr. Putin has launched this last anti-Ukrainian war. My next point is about this Russian-Ukrainian war, which especially I'd like to talk a little bit about the ideological basis for this war. This war is not an accident. It is not something that happened all of a sudden and Mr. Putin was forced, some kind of dragged into Ukraine, as some people claim, or some kind of was forced to take Crimea. It's a quotation. This war was carefully planned and prepared for many years. And there are several milestones on this way I would like to mention. First of all, for the corporation of KGB/FSB officers that was ascending to power in Russia in the 1990s and got this power, I would say absolute power, in the year 2000s, Ukraine was never considered to be an independent state. On March 25th, 1999, Vyacheslav Chernovil, dissident and human rights defender in Soviet times, the leader of the People's Ruch movement and a candidate in the 1999 presidential election in Ukraine, has been assassinated in the carefully organized car accident on the road Boryspil-Zolotonosha. The investigation by SBU, Security Service of Ukraine, established that several groups of FSB officers had been sent to Ukraine prior to this accident to fulfill their job. The beginning of massive preparation to the whole-fledged aggression against Ukraine can be detected as early as in summer year 2003, when Mr. Putin has admitted completely, it's quotation, completely unacceptable fact that the cradle of the Russian state, the mother Russian cities, Kiev, also site of the ancient epic Kiev-Pechorskaya Lavra, lies beyond boundaries of the modern Russian Federation. Later, the legend, falsified, of baptism of the great prince Vladimir Sviatoslavovich in the Greek city of Chersones, now this is a city limits of Sevastopol, has been brought to the attention of Mr. Putin. Therefore, according to this approach, the only two truly holy places of the Eastern Orthodox Church that most of the Russian population belongs to, namely Kiev and Chersones or Korsun in Russian or Sevastopol, happen to be on the territory of Ukraine, not in Russia. That was considered unacceptable, and it was a plan that was elaborated to bring those places, at least those two places, under the Russian control. You know that on September 5th, 2004, another presidential candidate in the Ukrainian election, Viktor Yushchenko, has been poisoned by dioxin and barely survived. The radical addition to methods of propaganda war, massive corruption of the Ukrainian officialdom, and Russian subversive actions in Ukraine in the form of the possible military solution of the Ukrainian question was made in the late autumn of year 2004 after refusal of the then Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma at the airport Vnukovo II meeting on December 2nd, year 2004 with Vladimir Putin to use force, including Russian troops, against demonstrators during the Orange Revolution, and after the final victory of Viktor Yushchenko in the third round of the presidential election of December 26, 2004. One of the versions of the military campaign against Ukraine with the possible use of the nuclear strike against Ukrainian troops near Kiev has been openly published on April 21, 2008 in the newspaper Независимая газета under the title The Mechanical Orange. In April 2008. Seimas, on April 4, 2008, during the NATO summit in Bucharest, Vladimir Putin told to George Bush Jr. that Ukraine is not a real state, while probably half of the territory of Ukraine is historically Russian one and should actually belong to Russia and should be brought to Russia. In over the last 5 years, the concept of the so-called Russian world has been developed. According to this concept, there is no such ethnic group like Ukrainians and Belarusians, and Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are the same, some kind of groups of one Russian people, and they should be brought under the same government roof. There are many facts that over the last 5 or so years can be demonstrated in this. But the official announcement of this ideological concept has happened on July 27, 2013, in Kiev, during the official ceremony of the 1025th anniversary of the baptism of Rus. Quotation of Mr. Putin: "The civilization choice has been made not only for Ukraine, but for the whole Holy Russia. It makes us united nation." In that speech, Putin, for the first time, has switched from using with the name Ukraine, preposition in, that in the Russian language is used with the state, not territory, that Mr. Putin used before that regularly, to preposition on, that in the Russian language is used with territory, not state. So instead of saying in Ukraine, he started to take on Ukraine with a very clear non-recognition of independent and sovereign state of this country. 2 days later, on July 29, 2013, with the attack of the Russia's chief sanitary doctor Omnishenko on Roschem chocolate candy, the Russian government began sanitary, trade, economy war against Ukraine. Later, in November 2013, it has been expanded into a diplomatic campaign that forced Mr. Yanukovych to reject signing the Ukraine-EU association agreement. Military campaign, as I mentioned already, has been started by Russian Ministry of Defense on February 20th. That is being commemorated in the medal that has been coined by the ministry for return of Crimea from February 20th to March 18th. It is also important to mention here that the ships, the military transportation ships with troops left their ports 7 or 10 days before the launch of this military operation. But this new ideological concept has been developed further during Mr. Putin's press conference on April 17, 2014. Then, for the first time in the history of Russia, and this is an absolutely historic event, historic term, Mr. Putin spoke about, quotation, the powerful genetic code of the Russian nation that makes us, Russians, different from and superior over other nations, and especially compared to the so-called Western genetic code. One of the most important features of the Russian genetic code, according to Mr. Putin, is ability, quotation, to die for the common cause publicly in front of eyes of the community. This is at least second time when Mr. Putin publicly spoke about the Russian genetic code and called for sacrifice of his compatriots. The previous one was on February 23, 2012, the day of the Soviet Army and Navy, during his rally for the third term of his presidency. Then Putin cited Russian poet Mikhail Lermontov and called to die, again quotation, to die for Moscow and win. After the press conference of April 17, 2014, the Russian official propaganda took a new level of virulent heat, with key propaganda persons explaining to the public what does it mean. One of them, Mr. Mamontov, whose office, as Russian press claims, is located inside the FSB building in Lubyanka, on April 29th, has explained that the unfolding war will be the world war, quotation, the Russia's war against the rest of the world. Sergei Kurginyan, another veteran of the propaganda wars, since his work for the KGB head Kryuchkov, leader of the August 91 coup, has clarified the new war will be not a third one. He correctly mentioned that the third one was a cold one that ended early 1990s, but the Fourth World War. Another veteran of propaganda was Sergei Markov on May 14, 2014, has explained in the Moscow Times article that the purpose of this new Putin's war against the Western alliance is to break it into two parts, into hostile Anglo-Saxon world that should be destroyed and friendly continental Europe. As it appears right now, the current campaign launched by Mr. Putin has three basic levels and three targets. First, on Ukraine. Ukraine either should be under Mr. Putin's control or it should be destroyed as independent and sovereign state. Second level, creation of the so-called Russian world. Under the roof of the Russian state and the so-called Russian world should be united the largest divided nation of the world, Russians. This is a quotation. That's exactly the quotation that has been used by Nazi propaganda in late 1930s, just in the preparation of the Second World War, and by Slobodan Milosevic in his attempt to so-called create a great Serbia. That this group of the categories that should be included into this Russian world are four. First, ethnic Russians, regardless where they live. Second, Russian-speaking people, regardless of their ethnicity. Third, compatriots and their offspring who ever lived on the territory of the USSR. Fourth, compatriots and their offspring who ever lived on the territory of the Russian Empire. Moreover, that's not only a concept written by strange kind of propaganda people. This is a law. This is a law that has been adopted by the Russian State Duma a couple of years ago that creates a legal basis for operations outside Russian borders. Moreover, another law has been adopted that gives legal right to use Russian military troops in other countries beyond the Russian borders to defend compatriots that belongs to the Russian world. The third level of this war is the Western alliance. The Western alliance should be broken into camps, these Anglo-Saxon worlds, but according to these propaganda people, and this kind of the general staff or whoever, Kremlin, includes US, UK, and the so-called front states. This kind of the term that has been borrowed from the war against apartheid in South Africa. To the front states belongs Poland and 3 Baltic states. And this camp should be destroyed. And the continental Europe that is made should be either neutral to new Putin's Russia or could even become a Russian ally. I don't have much time, but I just very briefly, last 3 points. This is a new war by many regards, and especially by so-called new type of warfare that is being used, or old type of new warfare that has been developed to new levels. The several terms have been used right now, like hybrid war or a new, unusual, non-conventional type of war. What is special that all the new technologies are being used simultaneously, and then combining the hard and soft power. I would mention some of them in which, as we can see, aggressor has achieved some level of, let's say, excellence. Intelligence, counterintelligence, and on the other hand, some kind of the very serious mistakes and failures on the intelligence on the other side, including from the NATO. Information, disinformation, and propaganda war, which now is going to be one of the most powerful instruments. Cyber war, a wide use of special forces, commanders of different types. Wide use of the so-called non-governmental actors, including NGOs, religious organizations, private persons, and so on, that are acting relatively independently, but under the overall guidance and centralized command. Wide use of subversive actions, new terrorist tactics using women and children as human shields in attacks on military objects and civil objects as well. Energy warfare, and you have a special session about this. Economic warfare, including trade, sanitary, financial, and other instruments. Corruption that brought to another level the almost full buyout of the political and military leaderships of the targeted countries, and Ukraine happened to be one of the very clear examples. The 5th column in Ukraine, in other post-Soviet states, and in the West, including Europe. The so-called Putin term, the Putin International, some kind of new combination or organization of different political parties and politicians that are openly being supported by Mr. Putin and themselves supporting Mr. Putin. One of the most important observations of these wars is there is no more clearly defined, visible, geographical, political, or military borders. So borders can be everywhere, within each country. So this is probably one of the special characteristics of this new Fourth World War. How to react to this? I think it's really time to create, to elaborate, to develop the counter strategy. Without such a strategy, it's impossible to achieve anything. First of all, it is necessary to understand this is a war. This is not a joke. This is not an accident. It's not a mistake. It's not a bad dream. It will not go out by itself. This is a war. And is any war, you either win or lose. And up to you, to your choice, what you would like to choose. Second, to understand the essence of the beast, which is aggressive Putin's regime. And it was aggressive internally within the country against the Chechens movement, against the democratic opposition, against whoever, and outside, against Georgia, against Ukraine, against Baltic countries and others. Unfortunately, this regime became much more powerful recently with these victories in Ukraine because it received substantial and very substantial support of the substantial portion of the Russian population. So right now we're dealing not only with the regime, but with not full, but with substantial portion of the Russian society that became revisionists and revanchists. And we need to understand it. Third, to understand necessity of preparation of the medium to long-term strategy, like 14 points of Woodrow Wilson in the First World War, or Atlantic Charter in the Second World War. or Mr. Churchill Fulton speech or whatever, just to understand the problem, to understand long-term targets and main instruments to achieve those targets. First, to understand mistakes that have been already made. I will not mention them, but if there will be questions, I will talk about this. Fifth, to come to understanding and agreement on the medium and long-term targets of the strategy, this counter-strategy. And sixth, to start to implement this strategy, constantly correcting the course. On my part, a group of people have prepared the draft of the document for consideration of the appropriate authorities of the NATO countries, and it is now under necessary analysis, scrutiny, and work. And I think it's a first step, but certainly it's not the last one, and I would invite everybody to work on this document and similar documents. It's impossible to discuss all these documents right now, but I would like to mention at least the crucial elements of the counter-strategy. First, in purely military area, it's quite clear that victory in this war cannot be achieved without developing a new military doctrine in this counter-strategy. In this so-called hybrid war, the traditional or conventional methods do not work fully, as we have seen it. So that is why soft power is wonderful, but itself, it does not deter use of force. Second, which became really one of the most important instruments in this attack, information, disinformation, and propaganda war. We see that one country by another can fall victims of this propaganda war. The first victim is Russia, Russian population, some part of the Ukrainian population, some part of populations of other countries, and including countries of Western Europe as well. This is a very delicate issue because there is no available ready instruments that would work with defense of the most cherished freedom of information, freedom of speech. We need to develop something that would preserve this freedom, nevertheless would not allow propaganda, and this is a very dangerous instrument. In the area of international law, it is absolutely crucial to develop a new definition of aggression. We have a definition of aggression that has been adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1974. Now, with new instruments, and clearly, this definition should be updated. In 1939, when aggressor attacked Finland, the Soviet Union, the League of Nations discussed this issue, and within 2 weeks has taken a decision of expulsion of the aggressor from the membership of the League of Nations. We can see what is the distance today, 75 years later. So aggressor has already made 2 absolute clear attacks on independent countries, but nothing similar has happened. We need to think what should be done about aggressor in new environment. As a result of this implementation of strategy should be some kind of Helsinki II Act with confirmation of borders in Europe that must be signed by all participants, including by the Russian administration, either current one or new one. Politics. There is a theory of democratic peace. Democracies do not fight each other, and probably we don't have example that democracy did fight each other. So that is why to solve the problem strategically is the only way to make Russia a democratic state, regardless how long it would take. This is a real solution to this crisis and to this war. It is something similar to the problem of Germany in the Second World War. This is a very special part of strategy, but nobody should be assured that new war will not be started even more prepared, better prepared, with more casualties and more bloodshed, unless Russia will become sooner or later a democratic state. Only then we can say that we achieved more or less stable world, reasonably lasting peace, Europe free, whole, democratic, and with peace among all countries and neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrei, for your such an interesting and very compressed presentation. Instead of reading many articles which appeared now, and many books probably which have been written about Russia, we have such an insightful and thoughtful presentation which we appreciate very much. I am a bit confused. Well, I know Russian language. I lived in former USSR. So should I be included into this list of potential allies of Mr. Putin, or I still can preside over this committee meeting? I'm a bit confused, but well, it's a more like a joke, but nevertheless, that joke has very tragic implementations in countries around us. Well, thank you indeed. Now we have time for good discussions, and I call on Nicole Goulet from France to present her question. Oui. Please.
Yes, it's Natalie, but it doesn't matter. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I have several questions. The first is not a question, but I would like to know whether we could have the text, the whole text of your presentation, as there are many, many references. I think it might be very useful for each and every one of us to have a copy of this briefing so that we may find the references you gave. I think it would be very interesting and very important, because these are very specific issues. You mentioned a certain number of elements, and in particular, all the everything that took place upstream. You talked about intelligence warfare. How do you explain that no intelligence service was able to foresee this act of aggression? Then you talked about a fourth World War. So either I missed one, because you talked about the Fourth World War, did you not? And the basic question, the most important question I would like to ask you is the following. Are you disappointed by the way in which the international community responded to this act of aggression? Was there any other possible response in the face of Mr. Putin's aggression, which comes on top of all frozen conflicts, Abkhazia, Ossetia, and Nagorno-Karabakh, to which I attached a great deal of importance? And is there a place for European defense?
Okay. As for the copy of the document, with your permission, I will give it to the Secretariat, and they will be able to distribute it for those who are interested. As for intelligence, I would like to mention at least two the most, some kind of dramatic failures of intelligence on the Western alliance, NATO, United States. They were not able to see preparation of the Russian war against Georgia in year 2008. They were absolutely taken by surprise. Even about 100,000 troops have been massed on the borders of Georgia. Even Mr. Saakashvili warned Western allies that the aggression is looming. Nevertheless, it has not been taken seriously. It has been some kind of taken as the normal situation. Nevertheless, we got this Russian-Georgian war with intervention. Another one example, it's this kind of spectacular failure of U.S. intelligence just on the brink, on the eve of the Crimean attack. Just one day before, the U.S. intelligence has announced that they are not expecting, publicly, they are not expecting any attack of the Russian troops on Crimea or on Ukraine. Next day, aggression started. So, but another example, later, in late, I believe, it was late March or early April, there was several people made statement that, okay, they're expecting attack of the Russian troops on Ukrainian territory within 2 days. With my all limited information resources, I came out and said, no, there will be no this intervention. There's only concentration of the forces for producing feeling of fear, but there will be no intervention. 2 days later, 2 weeks later, months later, there was no direct intervention of those attacks that was expected. So it shows that something really serious happened with intelligence, and this intelligence should be improved really on strategic level. As for Fourth World War, it is not the term that I like, and it is not a term that I invented. The term that has been used by Kremlin, and they're actually correcting those who are using the term Third World War. They're saying, no, come on, that's wrong, not Third World. Third World was a Cold War. It's finished 20 years ago. Now we are starting, and actually they're open, they are not kind of hiding. They're saying, we're starting the Fourth World War. And they're preparing for that for a long time. And actually, I heard this talk about this new world war for a long time. And I actually, even myself, I was saying that it's complete nonsense. It's something really absurd. It cannot be taken seriously. It's only some kind of really hot heads can talk about this issue. But now this is official policy. So that is why my job here is not some kind of to give you some kind of strange concept. I'd like to just to give you some information how these actions are being considered by the other side. How do they view these actions in Ukraine and in some other places? As for reaction of the world, definitely, I'm not happy with some reaction. First of all, with the lack of understanding what's going on and with the lack of desire to understand. That's even worse, because some people just don't want to see and to hear what is really going on. So it's up to definitely different countries and different nations and different organizations to take appropriate decisions. It's up to NATO, up to the United States, up to Europeans to decide what to do. But what is important just to understand what is really going on. I'd like to give one example of the reaction. If you are not aware how the Russian-Georgian war not ended, but some kind of how the movement of Russian troops have been stopped on the way to Tbilisi. On August 11th, in the morning of August 11th, year 2008, Russian troops started the full-fledged advance on Tbilisi. All troops in the South Caucasus received the same orders to take Tbilisi. And they started to move from Seashare, from Abkhazia with Black Sea Fleet, and even the Russian base in Emini has been taken to the highest alert. So, and Mr. Shamanov has been appointed as the commander-in-chief of all Russian troops in the South Caucasus with the purpose to take Tbilisi. This advance has stopped within 24 hours. There are several elements that were able to stop this advance. One of them was resistance of Georgian army element. Another, some kind of the flight of 5 presidents and prime minister, 3 Baltic ones, Ukrainian and Polish presidents to Tbilisi, and physical presence in Tbilisi. And the third element that has not been discussed very widely, the decision of the United States to move US Navy into the Black Sea and the relocation of the US Air Force to Romanian and Turkish air bases. The Russian General Staff has detected this movement, and actually it was not hidden, it was very open, and in 24 hours they stopped movement of Russian troops into Tbilisi. I'm not a bloodthirsty person, I'm from a different world, I'm an economist, and I don't like this stuff. But unfortunately, I have not seen any other elements that were able to stop the movement of hard military power towards Tbilisi. If the US or NATO would take something analogous, something similar steps, on 27th of February or on 28th of February, year 2014, when the group of Russian Spetsnaz has captured the building of the parliament in Simferopol, of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Probably this crisis could be solved that same day. The very fact that this decision has not been made neither then nor later, and due to the fact that unfortunately leading figures of the Western Alliance were saying that they're not going to use military force, even publicly said, make appetite of the aggressor even greater.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I have already a list of those who want to ask, and I will take questions in the group of two. First is on my list is Michael Szczerba, Poland. Sir.
Dear Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, Mr. Illarionov, thank you very much for your excellent, deep and useful presentation on the situation in Ukraine and its relation with Russia. Of course, we would like to express our solidarity with the people of Ukraine defending their national independence and territorial integrity. In 4 days, President Poroshenko will be in Warsaw attending the 25th anniversary of the free and democratic parliamentary elections in Poland. We are happy about this because Mr. Poroshenko will meet President of the US, France, Germany and other countries, and it will be a good chance to welcome the new elected Ukrainian president, but also to support him and to give the support of the transatlantic community and its leaders to him. Mr. Illarionov, you also mentioned the difficult situation in the occupied territories of Georgian regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It seems that Russia has established a pattern of using military force against and illegally occupying and now also illegally annexing territory of neighboring countries. My question is about the situation in Georgia. I mean, how the current situation in Ukraine and actions to destabilize the south and eastern regions of Ukraine can influence on the situation in Georgia, especially before the very important event we are looking for, which is signing the accession agreement with the European Union. So please comment on this, and thank you for your excellent presentation one more.
Thank you, sir. And next is Mr. Munor Alonso, Spain.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I would like to congratulate Mr. Illarionov for his very interesting presentation, very thought-provoking, and with very useful contributions, which come at a very timely time. I've looked into this issue very closely, and I was surprised how Putin uses the Islamophobic actors and authors, rather, from the 19th century and the 20th century. I've seen articles in the International New York Times, and this is very interesting because it seems he wants to connect to some very, older ideologies in Russia, and he also uses ideas of the Soviet times. So I've written something. Putin seems to move between neo-Tsarism and neo-Sovietism. And that's something which surprises me because it means that this revisionist operation which is taking place is being shrouded with a very broad ideology which receives the support of Russian public opinion, because according to polls, between 70 and 80% of the Russian population enthusiastically supports that position, which is an aggression for neighboring countries. I think you spoke about the need for a strategy, a counter-strategy to what Mr. Putin is doing, and I think we need to go back to the situation which Kennan proposed with his long telegram during Soviet times, which put an end to the illusions of those who thought that the Second World War allies could continue to be allies when the Cold War hadn't started. Now, there's some now who think that there can be a dialogue with Putin and that you can reach agreements. I see that as an increasingly difficult possibility. It seems that dialogue is now impossible because his mindset is totally different from ours. So I think that we should go back to the idea of containment, deterrence, adapted to this new moment. And I think we should consider how we're going to look at the fact that it's not just Putin. He's not isolated. He has a lot of support in Russia, which gives him strength and legitimacy. The counterweight would be the economic situation, which is difficult. But that's what concerns me, and that's what I wanted to submit to you. Thank you.
As for Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, and right now Crimea, it's quite clear that Mr. Putin is using those territories as a military basis. Actually, the largest military basis that we can see in the history and the kind of around the world. I studied the issues of Russian-Georgian war for 5 years, and actually the book that has been written on this issue, probably the most comprehensive on the subject. And I can claim that just the Abkhazia and especially South Ossetia became the most militarized regions of the world, most militarized nations or whatever territories in the world. On the number of tanks or armored machines or artillery pieces or number of troops per 10,000 of population, Abkhazia and South Ossetia exceeds North Korea by a factor of 3. Just to imagine this some kind of the size of military presence. So this is kind of the military basis of huge size. Something similar now is going with Crimea, with deployment of the new troops, of new military equipment, very heavy equipment with missiles on the Crimean territory. The Transnistria is also very well known for some kind of the location of the 14th Army. So we now know the pattern. Any new territory is going to be new military base of huge size. So that is why for Mr. Putin it's not easy to abandon those military bases for any purpose, even for some kind of for this discussion with new Georgian authority about the some kind of normalization of the relations. So they provide some kind of hints that seems to me cannot be fulfilled under the current political regime. They can say that, okay, that Georgia could be united, might be united, if Georgia would change the course. Instead of European integration, instead of the integration with NATO, if Georgia joined, let's say, Customs Union or Eurasian Union and would be some kind of ally with Russia. Seems to me this promise cannot be fulfilled under these current circumstances. It's my personal expert view. So, but such attempts have been taken towards Georgian new authorities. So, as for the question about these new ideologies, this is a very important question. This is a new question because it clearly has elements. It's not some kind of distilled new ideology. It's not like purely nationalism, even there are very clear elements of nationalism. It's not clear Tsarism or neo-Tsarism as you're using, but there is clear elements of this. There is not only neo-Sovietism, but clearly elements of that. We used to now some kind of the discussion use such a term like Orthodox Jamahiriya as the same kind of ideal state, ideal view for Mr. Putin of the Russian state, with elements of Tsarism, Sovietism, and nationalism, and orthodox approach to that. So we will try to some kind of to develop what would be the correct term, but it's quite clear that this is something new that is relying heavily on something that was available in the history of the country and what is available around the world. And it is really very important that to understand that we do not have really effective counter-ideology, counter-strategy to fight this new ideology. As for possibility of the dialogue, Mr. Putin is ready for dialogue, and he indicated very clear he is ready to have a dialogue with the European Union, with the United States on Ukraine. And the topic is very clear: how to divide Ukraine. How to take Crimea as some kind of to legitimize this occupation of Crimea, how to legitimize so-called federalization of Ukraine with this kind of establishment of the so-called separatist basis with Spetsnaz from Russia and Chechnya and so on. He is prepared for that. And his points of discussions are very clearly announced even last autumn. Non-bloc status for Ukraine, which should be included not only in the constitution of Ukraine, but should be included into the so-called international agreement on Ukraine, where signatories of this agreement would be Russia, US, and EU, that not only Russia would guarantee, but US and EU would guarantee that Ukraine would never join EU and NATO. That's the purpose. So if the Western side would be ready for such type of dialogue with Mr. Putin, he would be extremely happy.
Colleagues, I still have four of us who want to ask questions. I ask you to keep your questions and points as short as possible. Hans Siversen, Norway.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting introduction. We will celebrate, I should say, this year in Norway. It's 70 years ago that the Soviet army liberated northern Norway and withdrew. So there are some paradoxes, actually. But my question, do you see any division among the Russian leadership, or how far from the central leadership do you have to go before you find any other approaches? And secondly, do you see that the economic measures against Russia has any impact at all on the decisions made by Putin?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the arrival of our President, Hugh Bailey, to our committee. We salute you, Hugh. And next is Mr. Ostrak, Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, when we look to the Russian aggression cases, they are always preceded by some unease in economic situation in those countries. So do you think that Russia has some sort of, despite this, despite those countries are separated from Russia, does still have some leverage in those countries to create such an unease, or is it the result of what's happening in the global economy?
As for possibility of division in the Putin's elite, I don't see any sign for that. And you probably need to understand the nature of the political regime. It's not a democracy. It's not even a half democracy. It's not even Mr. Yanukovych's regime. This is an authoritarian regime, and according to the classification of political regime, it is hard authoritarian regime. Nobody around Mr. Putin, including his friends, colleagues, or some kind of whoever they are, have any real power in decision-making process, and they have no power and resources to influence the decision process over there. So that is why expecting that there will be some kind of division and some kind of building strategy relying on this expectation is wrong. We have no signs, we do not have not seen signs of anything like that, and we do not see it so far. It's like, some people do not like it, but with this all comparisons, it's like in 1944 expecting division with this Nazi leadership. So that division could happen, but it will usually after May 8th. As for economic measures and sanctions, so far we have not seen any serious sanctions, frankly speaking, against the aggressor, and those sanctions that have been targeted on some kind of personal level, so far they are, from my point of view, extremely ineffective. And in Kremlin are openly laughing about the sanctions. Certainly they do use those sanctions in the propaganda war, saying that, okay, that the West is surrounding us and some kind of waging a war against us and so on, but they do know that so far these sanctions or economic measures are not effective. Moreover, they have prepared for such type of approach for a long time. For example, there was such a campaign more than a year ago, so-called nationalization of elite in Russia, when Mr. Putin called for all leadership to withdraw assets from European banks, from US banks, to sell all assets, all some kind of houses or whatever, from Europe and the United States. It's a very serious preparation, some kind of long time before actual attack, actual aggression has happened. Something similar happened in year 2006, when all of a sudden Putin withdrew from the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe. And that time in year 2006, nobody could understand why, because there was no any sign, the reason of that. 2 years later, in August year 2008, with the Russian aggression against Georgia, it became known that he was thinking about what could some kind of make problems for him in this aggression long before, and he take precautionary measures. So the Russian leadership has prepared themselves very seriously to prolonged isolation or semi-isolation and some kind of economic measure against them, and they're prepared to be in this situation for years. So that is why, me personally, as economist, I could say these economic measures would have very limited effect, if at all, if any. As for use of an easy economic situation, yes, in the case of Ukraine, we have seen clearly that it was a very serious problem in Ukrainian economy that has been aggravated by the Russian actions with trade war, with economic war, with financial war, with sanitary war that made Ukraine falling into real crisis. It's clearly. But in the case of Georgia, it was very different. Georgia was growing 9% per year in the first half of year 2008. It was one of the fastest growing economy of that region. Nevertheless, it did not stop Mr. Putin from attack, and after that was some kind of very negative consequence. So it seems to me that this fact, if it is possible to use this situation, okay. If not, it's not. What is being used effectively, so-called favorable political situation. Right now, for Kremlin, the current economic situation in Europe, with a long economic crisis, is considered to be extremely favorable situation for attack, because Europe is not ready for any serious measures that would be counter to this aggression. And also they do consider the political leadership in the United States right now is relatively weak, that should be exploited at maximum during the remaining 2.5 years. And that is why they're trying to do as much as possible during this time. So that is why it's a very smart approach, using some kind of environment, either economic one or political one, to get to their targets.
Thank you, Andrei. And last two, those who want to ask, first is Mr. Pavlenko. Please observe the time limit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Illarionov, thank you very much for this bright presentation and very profound answers to the questions. I would like to ask you one thing. You describe quite an impressive picture, but we know that every evil would have its own fatal points and its own weak sides. So where does the skeleton, the immortal, has the egg with the needle that has to be broken? Thank you.
Thank you indeed. And colleagues, with your kind permission, may I give a floor to the Ukraine's ambassador to NATO. I believe he has a reason to be given this opportunity. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to thank Mr. Illarionov for his presentation. I asked for the floor not in my capacity as ambassador, but rather as an expert. What we discuss now and what we faced, it's absolutely new phenomena, which requires new approaches. It cannot be described in conventional terms with conventional methodology. And it's not a problem to upgrade the definition of aggression. The problem is what to do with UN, with Security Council, which failed to react on this new situation. And when we discuss the issue, it brings me up to works of well-known politicians, Gilas, Zinoviev, and novelist George Orwell, who described many years ago the situation like that. And referring to his famous novel Animal Farm, I would like also to propose to discuss what is going on in new terms. All of us know what is realpolitik. What we face now, I propose to call zoopolitics, which is driven by instincts, which has nothing to do with democracy, with reality. What we see that the desire of Mr. Putin to build a kingdom, surrounded by wall with Russian, so-called Russian world. I would prefer also to call this phenomena not Russian world, but Pax Russica, because during the times of Cold War we had Pax Americana and Pax Sovietica. It's time for Pax Russica. How to handle that? Thank you very much.
First of all, concerning these fatal points, I think there are two. The first one is Russian society. It's true, Russian society has been zombied, has been brainwashed very seriously. It's true. Nevertheless, the real, some kind of long-term victory could be achieved if Russian society would be some kind of would become again healthy, would understand what's going on. And in the business of healing the Russian society from this unconventional propaganda war, which actually we have not seen even in the Soviet times and the communists, because it's much more sophisticated and much more effective. The critical ally of the Russian society and Russian people is Ukrainian people. There is no more people, nation and society that closer to Russia and that has such a leverage in Russia than Ukraine. And it's a very interesting situation. Ukraine became victim of this aggression, but in Ukraine there is also keys, not all keys, but substantial portion of keys to success in this, let's say, new unconventional war. It is very difficult and it's not usual, and kind of substantial portion of Ukrainian society also is disappointed and some kind of under shock that the messages from Ukraine are not being met in Russia because of this zombie state of the Russian society. Nevertheless, strategically, Ukraine has a special role and could play the very important role in healing the Russian society and some kind of restoring democracy, rule of law, and this kind of the open society in Russia, as it happened actually in 17th century, which also Ukraine played a very important role. Another element is the West, but I would say probably the world. Because even in that Security Council that probably our ambassador, your ambassador, was referring to, it was quite striking to listen not only that US ambassador or British ambassador or French ambassador was some kind of making reprimands to the Russian representative, but also representative of African countries was saying that there's the rude violation of international law and principles. So that is why the world itself is much more prepared, is much more educated and much more adult than the leaders of some particular country. And that is why the joint efforts of the world, not only with the West, but the world, could be very helpful. But in the case if the world would be some kind of stick to principles, the principles that have been put into the United Nations Charter, but is not implemented in practice. So that is why all these aggressions have been made possible because of some problems in the international architecture, in the international relations and international security. So that is why, to address this issue, we can see that it's not only an issue of Mr. Putin. It's a very important problem, but also this aggression, enlightened some problems that existed already in the international system. And I have one more correction. With your permission, I would like to call this not Pax Russica. It's not a Russica approach. This is a Pax Putinica. Okay, let's fight against Pax Putinica. Okay, and substantial portion of Russians in Russia, and actually those Russians, ethnic Russians that are in Ukraine, in absolute majority are patriots of Ukraine and patriots of democratic and open society of Ukraine. So that is why this war should not be considered by anyone as a war against ethnic Russians or real Russians. That should be against authoritarian, aggressive Putin's regime.
Andrei, thank you very much for your presentation. Indeed, although you called Putin regime as powerful as it is, but having such an analysis, I would call it's probably one of the best weapons against that regime. I mean, to understand the principles and probably procedures they go on, it's a great deal. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for presenting us, and we all wish you all the best and looking forward to meet you on different occasions at NATO PA.